At the dawn of the 20th century, the age of exploration was reaching its twilight. The poles would soon be conquered, the highest peaks attempted, the great deserts crossed. Yet one frontier remained stubbornly impenetrable, the heart of the Amazon, where rivers the size of European nations drained into forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Colonel Percy Fawcett had spent years surveying South America's borders with the precision of a military cartographer. But beneath his rigorous methodology burned a conviction that would come to define and consume him. That the jungle concealed the ruins of a sophisticated ancient civilization. He called this lost city Zed, and he would stop at nothing to find it. What drives a man to sacrifice his health and his reputation for a theory most experts dismissed as fantasy? How does professional curiosity transform into obsession so absolute that it devours everything else? And was Fawcett a visionary who glimpsed truths that 20th century scholarship refused to acknowledge, or a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting desire eclipse reason? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is the story of Percy Fawcett's Lost City of Zed. The 20th century arrived in London with electric lights and motor cars, with the crackle of telegraph wires and the hum of industry reshaping the Thames. Yet beyond the fog and gaslight, beyond the marble corridors of the Royal Geographical Society, where bearded men studied maps over brandy and pipe smoke, there remained vast territories coloured blank on the cartographer's canvas. The Amazon basin was one such void, a green immensity that swallowed rivers the size of European nations, where the boundaries between countries existed only as diplomatic abstractions, and where the interior remained as mysterious as the surface of the moon. This was the age of the last great expeditions, when the scramble for geographical knowledge carried the same fervour as the scramble for empire. The poles beckoned, the heights of the Himalayas waited, and in South America, the question of what lay beneath that endless canopy of jungle obsessed the minds of explorers, scientists, and dreamers alike. It was an era when a man might still discover a river, name a mountain range, or stumble upon the ruins of civilizations the modern world had forgotten or never known existed at all. Into this crucible of ambition and inquiry stepped Lieutenant Colonel Percy Fawcett, a man forged in the exacting disciplines of the Royal Artillery and tempered by the colonial theatres of Ceylon and elsewhere across the British Empire. Tall and lean, with a bearing that suggested both military precision and an artist's sensibility, Fawcett possessed the rare combination of technical skill and romantic imagination. He was trained in surveying and cartography, in the use of sextant and theodolite, in the mathematics of triangulation that could pin a position on Earth to within yards. Yet he was also a man drawn to the inexplicable, a reader of esoteric texts, a believer in the possibility that history held secrets the rational mind had prematurely dismissed. When the Royal Geographical Society and the Bolivian government sought a surveyor to demarcate the disputed boundaries between Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru in 1906, they found in Fawcett the ideal instrument. Disciplined enough to endure the hardships, skilled enough to produce reliable maps, and driven by something deeper than mere professional obligation. That first expedition introduced him to the Amazon's brutal realities, the suffocating heat that turned clothing into sodden rags within hours, the insects that descended in clouds to feast on exposed flesh, the rivers that could rise 20 feet in a night, and the diseases that moved through camps and reduced strong men to fevered husks. Yet Fawcett also discovered something unexpected in that green hell. The indigenous peoples he encountered, those who had not yet been decimated by disease or enslavement, spoke of ruins in the deep interior, of cities built by ancestors whose achievements exceeded anything the conquistadors had imagined, stone roads swallowed by vines, monoliths carved with undeciphered symbols, evidence, they suggested, of a civilization that had flourished long before European contact. The colonial mind of the early 20th century struggled with such claims. The prevailing anthropological wisdom held that the Amazon could never have supported such advanced civilizations. The soil was too poor, the environment too hostile, and the indigenous peoples too primitive to have constructed anything resembling the great societies of the Andes or Mesoamerica. Fawcett himself had been skeptical at first, trained as he was in the empirical methods that demanded evidence over folklore. Then came the afternoon in 1908 that changed everything. He had been surveying a remote tributary of the Acre River with a man called Henry Costin, a skilled former British corporal and marksman who became a loyal and capable assistant to Fawcett. The two of them were working their way through terrain that seemed untouched by human presence for centuries. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and decomposing vegetation. The air was thick with the smell of rot and growth occurring simultaneously. They had stopped to take measurements near what appeared to be an unusual earthwork, a raised mound that seemed too geometric to be entirely natural. While Costin worked the theodolite, Fawcett began clearing vegetation from the mound's base with his machete. The first pottery shard emerged from the soil like a message from the dead. It was no larger than his palm, but the craftsmanship was immediately evident. The clay had been fired to a hardness that allowed it to survive centuries of jungle humidity. More striking still was the decoration. Intricate geometric patterns etched into the surface with precision that spoke of sophisticated artistic tradition. Fawcett knelt in the mud, heedless of the insects that crawled across his hands, and brushed away more soil. More fragments appeared. Then a piece large enough to suggest a curve of a vessel, decorated with stylized figures that resembled no indigenous art he had encountered in his travels. He called Costin over without looking up, his voice tight with excitement he rarely allowed himself to express. Together they excavated carefully, aware that their clumsy efforts might destroy more than they revealed. The mound yielded more pottery, some pieces decorated, others plain but well formed. There were no intact vessels, but the sheer quantity of fragments suggested this had been a site of habitation, and the qualities suggested a people with time and skill to invest in aesthetic refinement. Fawcett sat back on his heels, holding a particularly fine shard up to the filtered jungle light. The weight of it in his hand felt like vindication. This was not the crude pottery of nomadic tribes. This spoke of settled life, of surplus production, of a society organised enough to support artisans. The indigenous stories were not mere folklore, they were memories, distorted perhaps by time and retelling, but rooted in historical truth. Somewhere in this green immensity, civilizations had risen and fallen, leaving traces that the jungle had nearly, but not quite erased. He wrapped the pottery carefully in cloth and added it to his pack, understanding that these fragments represented more than archaeological curiosities. They were evidence that justified further search, deeper penetration into the interior, sustained exploration of the kind that might reveal not just pottery, but the cities from which such pottery had come. That night, camped beside the river with Costin keeping watch, Fawcett examined the shards by firelight and allowed himself to imagine the hands that shaped them. Potters working in clay in a city now swallowed by forest. Artists decorating vessels that would outlast their civilization. People who had solved the riddle of how to live in the Amazon, not as temporary intruders, but as permanent inhabitants who built, created, and endured. If such a society existed once, why not others? Why not larger settlements, more sophisticated engineering, cities that would dwarf these scattered pottery sites? The seed of obsession, planted by indigenous testimony, had found fertile ground in tangible evidence. Fawcett's subsequent expeditions between 1908 and 1910 became dual enterprises. Official boundary surveys that satisfied his sponsors, and unofficial archaeological investigations that satisfied his growing conviction that the Amazon concealed lost worlds. In the archives of Rio de Janeiro, he encountered the document that would give focus to his searching, Manuscript 512, a Portuguese text from 1753 describing an enormous abandoned city discovered by an expedition of Portuguese frontiersmen from Brazil. The author wrote of stone buildings, of plazas and arches, of hieroglyphs that resembled no known writing system. Fawcett gave this lost city his own designation, Z. Though whether Z referred to a specific location or became a symbol of all Amazonian civilizations he believed existed is a question without a definitive answer. What is certain is that Z became for him an obsession that transcended geographical curiosity. The pottery in his collection proved that advanced societies had existed. Manuscript 512 suggested they had built on a monumental scale. The task before him was to find the cities themselves, to document them with the rigour that would force academic orthodoxy to acknowledge what it had previously dismissed. Z was not a fantasy, but a probability, waiting in the forest for someone with sufficient determination to locate it. The Royal Geographical Society regarded his theories with polite scepticism. They valued his boundary surveys, which were indeed exemplary. His maps would prove accurate for decades, but his talk of lost cities struck many as romantic fantasy. Fawcett felt their condensation keenly. He had conducted 7 major expeditions by 1910, covering thousands of miles under conditions that killed lesser men. His observations were meticulous, his measurements precise. The pottery he brought back was real. Why should his interpretations be dismissed simply because they challenged comfortable assumptions? He needed more evidence. He needed to find Z itself, or something close enough to silence the doubters. By 1112, back in England between expeditions, he had become a man haunted by green distances. His wife Nina recognized the signs. The distraction during dinner conversations, the late night poring over maps, the restlessness that made domestic life feel like imprisonment. The jungle had marked him in ways that transcended physical scars. He belonged now to that brotherhood of explorers for whom civilization was merely the interval between expeditions. The commission, when it arrived, came at the opportune time. The Bolivian-Peruvian governments required a survey of the Heath River, a significant waterway forming part of the frontier but whose upper reaches remain unmapped. The Royal Geographical Society endorsed the expedition, seeing another opportunity for Fawcett to add detail to their charts. But Fawcett saw something more. The Heath River drained territories that fit his theories about where Z might be located. Transitional zones between high jungle and lowland bases that could have supported civilizations he envisaged. Indigenous accounts from previous expeditions had mentioned ruins in that general direction. If he were to conduct a thorough survey of the Heath, nothing prevented him from exploring adjacent areas, from investigating promising leads, from searching for the archaeological breakthrough that would transform him from competent surveyor to genuine discoverer. He accepted with the understanding that it served dual purpose. Officially, he would map the river and establish coordinates to settle boundary disputes. Unofficially, he would search. Every expedition to the Amazon was a gamble with death, but if he were to risk that fate again, he would do so in service of both contractual obligation and personal quest. The preparation consumed months. Henry Costin would accompany him again. The tough corporal had proven he possessed the rare combination of physical endurance and mental stability necessary for extended jungle travel. Costin asked few questions and complained less, traits that Fawcett valued above almost any other. Supplies were selected with meticulous attention. Dried goods and tinned provisions, surveying equipment packed in waterproof cases, medical supplies including quinine, mosquito netting despite its weight, and rifles for hunting and defence. He corresponded with the Royal Geographical Society throughout this period, his letters maintaining careful balance between professional surveyor and theoretical adventurer. He outlined plans to trace the Heath to its source, to document flora and fauna, to collect anthropological observations. But he also mentioned, almost casually, that he would investigate reports of archaeological interest should the opportunity arise. The Society's response was cordial but non-committal. As departure approached, Fawcett felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread. The Amazon had nearly killed him on multiple occasions. He carried the scars and memories of companions less fortunate. Yet the thought of Z, of being the man that proved its existence, outweighed every rational consideration. History remembered discoverers, and Percy Fawcett intended to be numbered among them, whatever the cost. In late 1911, he stood once more on the threshold of the unknown. The journey to La Paz, the final arrangements with Bolivian officials, the procurement of local guides, these were familiar rituals now. But as he checked his instruments one final time, as he reviewed his maps and calculated the distances ahead, Fawcett understood that this expedition represented something more than another survey commission. The Heath River would either bring him closer to Zed or prove that his theories were delusions. The expedition departed La Paz in the wet season, when rivers ran high and the jungle steamed with moisture. They travelled first by mule along precarious mountain trails, descending towards the jungle's edge. That dramatic transition where brown, austere highlands gave way suddenly to overwhelming green. Then came the rivers, first the larger waterways where steamers maintained irregular contact with civilization, then smaller tributaries that narrowed as they pushed deeper into territory where maps offered only speculation. Percy Fawcett, surveyor and seeker, pushed his canoe away from the last outpost of reliable settlement and pointed its bow toward the interior. Behind him lay England, family, the approbation of learned societies. Ahead lay the Heath River, uncharted and waiting, and beyond that, perhaps, lay Zed, the city of his obsession, the vindication of his theories, the discovery that would justify every hardship he had endured. The jungle closed around him like a green cathedral, its canopy filtering the sun into dim, aqueous light. The soundscape rose to meet them, the screech of unseen birds, the rustle of leaves concealing 1,000 forms of life, the eternal drone of insects that formed the forest's breathing rhythm. This was no longer the world of maps and theories, of academic disputes conducted in comfortable rooms. This was the Amazon itself, indifferent to human ambition, unimpressed by credentials or military bearing. Fawcett had returned to the only place where Zed could be found, and the only place that might destroy him in the search. The Heath River announced itself not with grandeur, but with deception. From its confluence with the Madre de Dios, it appeared navigable, almost welcoming. A brown ribbon of water perhaps 60 yards wide, moving with the sluggish current characteristic of lowland Amazonian rivers. Fawcett stood in the lead canoe, using a pole to test depth, his eyes scanning for submerged obstacles. Behind him, Costin managed the stern with quiet efficiency, no wasted motion, no complaints, the kind of steady competence that required no acknowledgement. The first week proceeded with grinding monotony. Paddle upstream against the current, make camp as equatorial darkness fell with its characteristic swiftness, sleep fitfully while the night chorus rose to deafening levels, resume at first light. Fawcett took his measurements methodically, river width, compass bearings and astronomical observations when the canopy permitted. This was the work that justified the expedition officially, the cartographic data that would satisfy the commission and add detail to the maps. But his attention drifted constantly toward the banks, searching for anomalies. Every clearing suggested deliberate construction. Every geometric pattern in the vegetation hinted at ancient earthworks. The pottery from his earlier discovery remained wrapped in his pack, a talisman he touched sometimes at night. Zed was here somewhere, waiting beneath the canopy. The river narrowed as they pushed upstream, the gentle current transforming into something more aggressive. Rapids appeared, long stretches where water churned over hidden rocks. When navigation proved impossible, they portaged through jungle that resisted every step. The forest floor a treacherous tangle of roots and mud. What appeared as half a mile on Fawcett's sketched map could consume an entire day of brutal labour. They reached the upper heath after 6 weeks of hard travel. The river had transformed into something barely wider than a stream, choked with fallen trees. The forest had changed as well. Constant mist reduced visibility to a few yards in any direction. The world became grey-green and claustrophobic. Every direction looked identical to the last. It was here in this ghostly landscape that Fawcett found more pottery. He excavated with trembling hands despite the fever beginning to build in his blood. The fragments confirmed human occupation, sophisticated ceramic work, but these were scattered remnants, not the monumental architecture he sought. The discovery should have satisfied him. Instead, it intensified his need. He insisted on pushing further into the interior, leaving the main river behind. The porters grew increasingly nervous. This was territory beyond their knowledge, and the silence of the forest felt oppressive, watchful. They were cutting a new trail through particularly dense undergrowth when the first arrow struck. It hit a tree beside Fawcett's head with a solid thunk that seemed impossibly loud in the muffled forest. For a heartbeat, no one moved at all of them staring at the arrow's shaft, still quivering. Then Costin's voice cut through the paralysis, a single sharp command that sent them all scrambling towards the stream where they had left the canoes. More arrows hissed through the foliage. One of the porters cried out and stumbled, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. The forest exploded with movement. Figures emerged from the green wall, warriors with faces painted in stark geometric patterns, bodies moving with terrifying purpose through terrain that had seemed impenetrable moments before. They carried spears and clubs, and their silence was somehow more frightening than any war cry could have been. Costin had already reached the wounded porter, hauling him toward the stream. His movements were economical, unhurried despite the chaos, the practiced calm of a soldier who had been under fire before. He half dragged, half carried the injured man while simultaneously retrieving his rifle. His shout to abandon the packs barely registered with Fawcett, whose first instinct was to grab the waterproof case containing his instruments. An arrow sliced past his face close enough that he felt the air displacement. The decision made itself. He ran. The canoes were perhaps 30 meters away, but the distance felt infinite. Behind him, the warriors crashed through the undergrowth, their pursuit swift and certain. One of the remaining porters reached the boats first and was already pushing off, panic overriding any thought of waiting. Costin shoved the wounded man into the second canoe, then turned and raised his rifle. Not to fire, but as a deterrent. The weapons present created a momentary hesitation in the pursuit, and in that brief window, Fawcett threw himself into the boat. Costin followed, using his boot to push off from the bank in the same motion. Arrows struck the water around them, creating small geysers. One hit the hull and stuck there, vibrating. Fawcett grabbed a paddle and drove it into the water with desperate strength, while Costin worked the stern. The warriors reached the bank and several waded into the stream, but the current caught the canoe and carried it beyond their reach. Within moments, the curve of the stream carried them around a bend, and the warriors vanished into the grey-green twilight behind them. Fawcett's heart was beating through his chest, and his hands shook as he paddled. They had been so close to penetrating deeper, to finding whatever lay beyond that defended territory. The warriors' intensity suggested they were protecting something. Ruins, perhaps. The violence of their response seemed like confirmation that Zed existed nearby, that he had been on the verge of discovery before being driven back. They pulled to shore after half an hour. The wounded porter lay in the bottom of his canoe, his breathing shallow and pained. Fawcett examined the wound with his hands that were not quite steady, aware that they had lost their medical supplies in the abandoned packs. Food, spare clothing, surveying equipment, all left behind. They were reduced to what remained in the canoes, barely enough to sustain them on a retreat, utterly insufficient for continued exploration. Yet the thought of turning back now felt like abandonment of everything he had sacrificed to reach this point. That evening, they made camp on a sandbar. Fawcett cleaned the porter's wound with boiled river water and bound it with strips torn from his shirt. Costin prepared thin stew from the remaining rice, portions so meagre they served more as a reminder of hunger than satisfaction. Fawcett announced they would rest 2 days, then continue upriver. He watched Costin's face for objection and saw it there. Carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Two days later, both porters were gone. They had taken one of the canoes during the night and disappeared downstream, choosing uncertain retreat over certain death. Just him and Costin now. Fawcett insisted they continue with the single remaining canoe, rationalising that they could move faster without accommodating men who lacked fortitude. The fever that had been building in his blood fully manifested as they pushed further upstream. It came in waves that left him shaking with chills despite the oppressive heat. He took quinine from their dwindling supplies, but the shaking continued, along with a fatigue that made every movement require conscious will. The jungle began to shimmer at the edges of his vision, solid forms becoming uncertain. They found more pottery, and Fawcett excavated it with obsession that exceeded reason. But the fragments told no more stories, pointed to no cities. He began to see patterns everywhere, geometric clearings that dissolved into natural windfall upon approach, stone structures that proved to be weathered formations. His mind was constructing what it desperately wanted to find, because the alternative was unbearable. One morning, he spotted what appeared to be an earthwork from their camp, a raised area perhaps half a mile inland. He informed Costin he would investigate and return within 2 hours. The concern in Costin's expression was clear, but rank held, and Fawcett took his machete and compass and pushed into the forest alone. The earthwork existed, or something like it did, a raised mound too geometric to be entirely natural. He climbed it eagerly, searching for evidence of human construction. The fever made his hands shake as he dug, uncovering roots and rocks, but nothing worked by human hands. When he stood to get his bearings, the disorientation hit him like a physical blow. The trees all looked identical, the mist had thickened. Which direction had he come from? He had failed to mark his trail properly. Lost. The word echoed in his mind with the weight of a death sentence. He tried to use his compass, but his hands shook too violently to read it. The needle seemed to spin without settling. He picked a direction and walked, cutting vegetation, calling out for Costin. His voice disappeared into the forest, absorbed and nullified. It was then when the city appeared. It emerged from the mist gradually, stone buildings rising from the forest floor, their walls covered in vines, but unmistakably worked stone, fitted together with precision. Plazas stretched out between structures, and in the center stood a pyramid, stepped and ancient, its summit disappearing into the clouds. Z. Fawcett stumbled forward, his heart hammering. This was everything, every theory vindicated, every sacrifice justified. The city spread before him in magnificent decay, testament to a civilization that had mastered the jungle, that had built monumentally in the face of nature's hostility. He could see figures moving between the buildings, inhabitants going about their daily lives, or perhaps they had been waiting for him, knowing that eventually someone would come who possessed the vision to find what they had hidden. He moved closer until finally reaching out to touch the nearest wall, but his hand passed through the stone as if through smoke. The city before him flickered, stone became mist, solid architecture dissolved into hanging moss and shadow. The figures resolved into vegetation swaying in a breeze he could not feel. The pyramid collapsed into a natural hill. Z vanished, revealing itself as a fever dream, as hallucination, as the desperate construction of a mind that wanted so badly to find what it sought that it conjured it from nothing. Fawcett sank to his knees in the mud. The machete fell from his grip. Around him, the jungle reformed into its mundane reality. Trees and vines and rot. Nothing more. No city, no civilization, no Z. For the first time since he begun his quest, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Z might not exist. Or if it did exist, it might be forever beyond his ability to locate. The Amazon was too vast, too effective at erasing human works. 1,000 cities could lie beneath the canopy, and a man could search his entire life and find nothing but fever dreams. The despair was physical, a weight that pressed him down into the earth. He lay there in the mud while the mist curled around him, and the forest sounds rose to fill the silence. Time lost meaning. The fever carried him in and out of consciousness, and in his delirium, Zed appeared again and again, beautiful and haunting, and always dissolving when he reached for it. The city became a living thing in his fever, speaking to him in voices that might have been memory or madness. It showed him the vast plazas where ceremonies had unfolded, chambers where knowledge had been preserved, networks of roads connecting settlements. It showed him everything he had dreamed of finding, then snatched it away each time he tried to grasp it. He wept. All the years of searching, all the expeditions and suffering and sacrifice, all of it leading to this moment of dissolution, lying alone in the mud while his mind showed him cities that did not exist and never had. He lay there for hours before Costin eventually found him. The corporal had waited the promised 2 hours, then longer, before finally accepting that something had gone wrong. And by the time he found him, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Fawcett was barely conscious, muttering about cities, his skin burning with fever. Costin lifted him and began carrying him back to camp, navigating through the trackless forest with the sure instinct of a man who understood that haste led to death. When they reached camp, he laid Fawcett in a hammock and forced water between his lips, then prepared their last quinine in careful dosage. Fawcett drifted in and out of consciousness through that night and the next day. When lucidity finally returned, he found himself weak as a newborn. Costin sat nearby, and in his face, Fawcett read the verdict. They were leaving. Some part of him, the part that had survived 7 previous expeditions, recognized they had reached the absolute limit. To go further would be to die, and death would mean all of his discoveries would disappear into the jungle with him. The retreat downstream was brutal. Their food ran out within days. Fawcett's fever persisted, and there were stretches where Costin had to paddle alone while Fawcett lay curled in the bottom of the canoe. When they finally reached civilization, they were skeletal figures, their clothing in rags, their bodies marked by disease and deprivation. The expedition had lasted nearly 2 years and had taken everything from them except their lives. Fawcett returned to England in 1913, carrying maps that would please the Royal Geographical Society and pottery fragments that hinted at his theories. But more than these, he carried a transformation that everyone recognised immediately. The Heath River had stripped something from him, some element of restraint that had previously kept his obsession within manageable bounds. He had seen Zed shimmering in the mist, and though it had proven to be a hallucination, the vision had convinced him more thoroughly than any physical evidence could have that the city existed. Nina noticed the change first. Her husband had returned physically depleted, but the real difference was in his eyes. A quality of distant focus, as if he was always looking past the present moment towards something only he could perceive. The Heath River expedition had not satisfied his curiosity, but intensified it beyond anything she had seen before. The Royal Geographical Society received his report with appreciation for the cartographic work and polite skepticism about his broader theories. Fawcett felt their condescension like a physical wound. He had nearly died bringing back evidence, and still they regarded him as a competent technician whose speculation could be indulged but not taken seriously. He began planning his return before he had fully recovered. The pottery sat on his desk, each piece a promise. Zed was real. The hallucination had shown him this. Not the city itself perhaps, but the possibility of a city. The Heath River had not revealed it, but that merely meant that he had been searching in the wrong direction. Zed was out there, the jungle held it, and Percy Harrison Fawcett would find it or die in the attempt, because there was no longer any options he could envisage for his life. 12 years separated the Heath River from what would become Fawcett's final expedition. The Great War came and consumed a generation, and Fawcett served with distinction. His surveying skills adapted to artillery ranging. He survived battles that killed millions and returned with another set of scars to add to those the jungle had given him. but the war only deepened his need for Zed. He returned to the Amazon intermittently throughout the early 1920s, shorter expeditions that added to his knowledge but never achieved the breakthrough he sought. By 1925, he believed various pieces of evidence had converged to indicate a specific region in the Mato Grosso where Zed most likely existed. Indigenous accounts from multiple sources described ruins in that area. The geography fit his theories. He had also obtained what he considered crucial: a small stone idol covered in markings that suggested sophisticated symbolic communication discovered by a prospector who gave him vague indications of its origin. But this expedition would be different in a crucial way. Not only would Costin not be by his side, having recently married after returning from the war, his son Jack would accompany him. Jack had grown from boy to man during his father's absences, shaped as much by Fawcett's absence as his presence. Now 21, tall and strong with something of his father's intensity, he had begged to join the expedition. Fawcett had resisted initially, knowing what he was asking of anyone who accompanied him into the interior. But Jack persisted, and perhaps Fawcett recognised that his own age was becoming a factor. He was 57 now, his body marked by decades of tropical disease. How many more expeditions did he have in him? Having Jack along meant the quest could continue beyond his own life. They would take a third man, Riley Rimmel, Jack's best friend, young and eager and drawn to adventure in the way young men are when they have not yet learned that death is more than abstraction. Fawcett laid out the hardships they would face, the diseases, the hostile groups, the simple fact that the jungle destroyed most men who challenged it. Rimmel listened with the polite attention of someone who believes bad things just happen to other people. Nina watched the preparations with an expression that mixed resignation and barely suppressed dread. She had lost her husband to the jungle already over the decades, but this time he was taking their son. If something went wrong, she might lose the both of them. She asked him once whether Zed was worth it, worth risking Jack, worth the possibility that she might never see either of them again. Fawcett looked at her with eyes that held something like sorrow, but also absolute conviction, and told her that some things matter more than safety. She asked nothing more after that, but something in her head had already begun the process of mourning. They departed England in February 1925, reaching Brazil and making their way inland to Cuiabá by April. Fawcett kept the destination deliberately vague in his public statements. The Royal Geographical Society and various newspapers had shown interest, but he had learned caution about revealing too much. Zed, when found, would be his discovery and no one else's. His actual route and specific objectives he kept private, confiding only in Nina in his journal. They left Cuiabá at the end of April, heading north into territory that became progressively less known with each day's travel. For the first weeks, they passed through areas where ranchers and prospectors maintained some presence, and Fawcett sent letters back with people travelling in the opposite direction. The last of these letters, dated May 29th, was sent from a place called Dead Horse Camp. In it, Fawcett wrote to Nina with unusual optimism. They were making good progress. The route was challenging but manageable. Jack and Rimmel were performing well, adapting to the hardships better than they had dared hoped. They would soon be entering the territory where he believed Zed was located. He expected to be out of contact for several months, but assured her they would emerge eventually, either with the discovery of a lifetime or with valuable information that would guide their next attempt. The letter's tone was confident, almost cheerful, but it contained instructions that suggested he recognized the risks. If they had not returned or sent word within a year, she should not send a search party. The jungle was too dangerous, too vast. Any rescue expedition would likely meet the same fate. Better to accept their loss than compound it. That letter was the last communication anyone would receive from Percy Fawcett. They simply vanished. The jungle closed around them and left no trace, no evidence of their passage, no indication of whether they had died quickly or slowly, whether they had found Zed or died searching for it. The most credible accounts suggest they made it as far as the territory of the Kalapalo people, who reported seeing 3 white men passing through. The Kalapalo had warned Fawcett not to proceed further, that the tribes beyond were hostile. But Fawcett had thanked them and continued anyway, disappearing into the forest beyond. After that, nothing. The Amazon had done what it did best, erased human presence so completely that even the search for that presence became futile. Dozens of expeditions went searching for them over the following decades. Some returned with rumours of indigenous people who claimed to have seen white men. Others brought back items that might or might not have belonged to Fawcett. Nina spent the rest of her life waiting for word, refusing to believe that Fawcett and her son were dead, maintaining into her old age that they had found Zed and they would emerge when ready. She kept Fawcett's study exactly as he had left it, the pottery and stone idol still on his desk, his maps spread across the table as if he might one day walk through the door. The truth of what happened remains unknown. The jungle keeps its secrets with a thoroughness that modern technology has barely penetrated. If their remains exist, they could lie within yards of a modern road and never be found, covered by decades of leaf litter, indistinguishable from the countless other bones that mark the Amazon's history. Whether Zed existed in the form he imagined remains uncertain. Modern archaeology has revealed he was correct in his fundamental assertion. The Amazon did support advanced civilizations. Recent discoveries using LiDAR technology have uncovered extensive earthworks, road networks, and settlement patterns that suggest populations far larger and far more sophisticated than early 20th century anthropology believed possible. The soil itself bears evidence of deliberate modification that allowed sustainable agriculture. In his core insight that the jungle had been home to complex societies, Fawcett was vindicated decades after his death. But the specific city he sought has never been found. Perhaps it existed and remains hidden. Perhaps it was mythological from the start, a composite of various ruins and legends that Fawcett synthesized into a singular destination. The Amazon keeps him still, somewhere in its green depths, along with his son and their companion and all others who ventured too far in pursuit of the dreams the jungle would not yield. But Zed endures, not as a place on any map, but as an idea, a symbol of all the lost cities and vanished civilizations, and hidden truths that might exist beyond the comfortable boundaries of known reality. And Percy Fawcett endures with it, forever searching, forever vanishing into the green immensity that called him with a voice that he could never refuse. The last great mystery of the age of exploration claimed him completely, and in doing so, ensured that both mystery and the man who pursued it would never be forgotten. Well then, there you have it. If you've watched this far and like what you've heard, then consider liking and subscribing. Also, you can hit the notification bell if you want to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, this really helps not only push these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but helps reassure me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then, what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.